Tonight, we begin with a development that, if even half of the reporting around it is accurate, represents a psychological rupture inside Russia's war machine. Not a slow-motion shift, not a months-long buildup that everyone could see coming, but a sudden cross-border shock that Russian commanders had publicly waved away as impossible, and that the Kremlin had quietly depended on as a pillar of its domestic narrative, that the war could be brutal and costly. Yes, but it would remain safely over there, kept away from Russia's own border regions by layered defenses, tight control, and the unspoken assumption that Ukraine would never dare to change the geometry of the conflict with ground forces. And yet, in recent days, a wave of reports, some from open-source analysts, some from battlefield-adjacent Russian commentary channels, and some from cautious Western assessments, has described Ukrainian units pushing into Russia's Kursk region in a way that appeared to catch local Russian defenses flat-footed, triggering what multiple accounts characterize as frantic, irregular communications up the chain of command, the kind of "we need help now" messaging that bypasses normal protocols, not because someone is being dramatic, but because the officers on the ground believe they are losing control of the situation in real time. To be clear, in modern war, information is contested. Both sides shape narratives. Fog and propaganda are constant. But that is precisely why the specific pattern here matters. When pro-Kremlin channels that normally minimize setbacks begin describing confusion, thin defenses, and rushed reinforcements, that is usually a sign that something real has happened that can't be fully contained by spin. The logic of this moment begins months earlier, not with one dramatic event, but with a silence, Ukraine's operational rhythm shifting just enough to be noticed by people who watch these wars the way meteorologists watch storms, reduced activity in one sector, equipment that suddenly stops appearing in the places it should be, unusual discipline in unit social media behavior, and the sense that a resource is being conserved for a single concentrated move. Russia, according to many of these accounts, saw hints of something but dismissed them for a reason that goes beyond tactics. Moscow had internalized its own assumption that Ukraine would remain constrained by Western caution, by fear of escalation, by the political risk of being portrayed as bringing the war to Russia, and by the belief that any such move would trigger a unified, punishing response from the Kremlin. That assumption is not just military, it's political. It's the kind of assumption that lets a leadership sell the war to its public as controlled, manageable, and fundamentally distant. So when reports surfaced of Ukrainian mechanized elements pushing across the border in Kursk, what made it so destabilizing was not merely the miles on a map. It was the message that the old psychological boundary had failed. And once that boundary fails, the Kremlin faces two battles at once: the battlefield problem of stabilizing a sector, and the narrative problem of explaining why Russian territory is suddenly in play after years of official assurances that it would not be. Accounts describe early Russian interpretations as a probe or a small incursion, the kind of framing that buys time and preserves calm, until the next set of reports suggested it wasn't a probe at all, but something closer to an operational push supported by drones, artillery coordination, and electronic warfare, capabilities that, when combined, tend to overwhelm lightly held positions and punish ad hoc counterattacks. And here is where the panic call framing becomes meaningful as analysis even without official confirmation. In militaries, especially centralized ones, commanders are trained to report problems in a way that does not threaten careers. When the tone shifts to urgency and improvisation, it often means the usual reporting language is no longer sufficient because the situation is outrunning the template. In that context, the Kremlin's first responses, where they have been reported, take on a familiar shape: categorical condemnation, labels meant to delegitimize, promises that the situation is temporary, and declarations that it will be resolved quickly. The purpose of that posture is not primarily to inform. It is to reassure and to reassert control. But control depends on facts catching up to the statement, and if they don't, the gap becomes dangerous, because the public starts listening to unofficial sources, the very military bloggers and regional channels that the Kremlin has tolerated and sometimes used, but that can become a liability when they describe a reality that contradicts official calm. The deeper question is why this kind of move, if it occurred as widely described, could happen at all. One answer is structural. Russia's military has been stretched by a long war of attrition, distributing manpower and equipment across multiple fronts, rotating units unevenly, and relying on a mix of formations with very different readiness levels. Border security forces and internal troops can deter small raids, but they are not always designed to stop a coordinated push. Another answer is strategic. Russia's planning may have prioritized offensive effort and rear area logistics on the assumption that the border itself did not require robust defense against a large ground action. And that assumption, if exploited, creates a cascade. Thin defenses lead to rapid breakthroughs. Rapid breakthroughs force rushed reinforcements. Rushed reinforcements arrive without cohesion. And without cohesion, they become vulnerable to prepared kill zones, drone spotting, and targeted strikes on communications nodes. Some reports have gone further, describing Ukrainian targeting of command posts, depots, and relay points in the area, less about dramatic conquest and more about disabling the very mechanisms that would allow Russia to respond effectively. That kind of approach is what makes an operation feel bigger than the ground it covers, because it attacks the system that turns units into an army: coordination, logistics, and command and control. If those are degraded early, even a numerically larger defender can appear disorganized. And disorganization is contagious. It spreads fear, fuels rumor, and prompts commanders to overcorrect. And that is the strategic dimension that explains why officials in Moscow would be alarmed even if the physical scope were limited. It creates uncertainty about what else Ukraine can do, where else the war can move, and how secure Russia's border regions actually are under sustained pressure. This uncertainty hits Putin in a sensitive place. His governance model is built on the promise of stability, predictability, and control. A cross-border shock undermines all three at once. It invites hardliners to demand escalation and punishment. It invites pragmatists to worry about sustainability. It invites ordinary citizens in border regions to ask why the state that claims to be strong cannot prevent disruption at home. And it creates a dilemma that is familiar in realist terms. A leader who is pressured domestically and embarrassed strategically is more likely to choose actions that restore the appearance of strength, even if those actions are risky. That is why analysts watching this kind of event focus on what comes next, rather than what has already happened. Will Russia divert forces from contested fronts to shore up the border, trading offensive pressure elsewhere for domestic reassurance? Will it attempt rapid counterattacks that could produce more losses and more visible failure? Will it reach for escalation tools in the air and long-range domain, trying to impose costs on Ukraine's cities and infrastructure in a way that signals, we can still punish you? In a war like this, that last option is especially grim because it can produce short-term psychological impact without achieving the kind of military effect that changes the battlefield, and it can harden the opponent's resolve rather than break it. This is also where Western politics enters the story, because cross-border operations intersect with the debate about constraints, escalation management, and what support looks like when the battlefield changes. If Ukraine demonstrates that it can alter the conflict's geography, it gains leverage, not only in military terms, but in diplomatic and psychological terms. It complicates Moscow's calculations, it challenges assumptions about inevitability, and it forces partners in the West to reconsider whether containment of the war's location is still a meaningful concept. At the same time, it raises anxiety about miscalculation. Because the more the conflict touches Russian territory, the more Moscow may feel compelled to prove it can reassert deterrence. That's why the most important signal in the coming days may not be the loudest statement from the Kremlin, but the pattern of Russian movements and messaging, whether reinforcements appear coherent or improvised, whether official media keeps insisting everything is fine or starts acknowledging difficulties, whether Putin speaks quickly to project control or stays unusually quiet while choices are made behind closed doors. Quiet in this context is not calm. Quiet is calculation. And calculation is where the risk lives, because the Kremlin is likely trying to decide whether this was a contained embarrassment or the beginning of something that threatens the war's narrative foundation. Ukraine's apparent wager, again, if the reporting holds, is that Russia's system is more brittle than it looks, and that pressure applied in unexpected places can force Russia into bad options, stretching forces thinner, exposing logistical seams, and revealing to domestic audiences that the war is not perfectly controlled. Russia's counter-wager is that fear of escalation and the weight of Russian resources will eventually limit Ukraine's freedom of action. The world is now watching which wager is closer to reality. Because if Ukraine can demonstrate repeatable capability to impose operational dilemmas inside Russia's border regions, even at a limited scale, then the Kremlin's core narrative, control, security, distance, takes lasting damage. And if the Kremlin responds by escalating in ways that increase civilian harm and widen the war's footprint, it may satisfy demands for strength at home while deepening Russia's strategic isolation abroad. Either way, this moment, more than a single incursion or a single counterattack, is about the collapse of an assumption that Russia could wage a long war without the war ever feeling close to home. The reports of frantic calls upward, of commanders scrambling, of officials reaching for denial before they reach for strategy, all of that taken together suggests something profoundly uncomfortable for Moscow, that the line it counted on has been crossed, and that once psychological boundaries break in war, they rarely return to their old shape.